A soft hum of a clock filled the dimly lit room. The faint scent of polished oak and ink hung in the air, mixing with the faint musk of old books stacked carelessly along the walls. Alexei sat alone, his hands resting on the worn leather cover of a book titled The Curious Parallels of History. The title seemed harmless enough. Yet, as he turned the pages, a creeping unease settled over him. Each line revealed uncanny coincidences between two American presidents, Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. Elected exactly 100 years apart. Both men were assassinated on a Friday. Both shot in the head. Each succeeded by a man named Johnson. His fingers traced the grainy image of Lincoln's somber face, etched into the paper. The dull yellow of the desk lamp illuminated the pages, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. The words blurred slightly, as though the book itself resisted his gaze. Alexei exhaled, his breath fogging the cool surface of his glasses. The parallels grew more bizarre with each passing moment. Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy who warned him not to go to the theater. Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln who warned him not to go to Dallas. The room seemed to close in, the air thickening with something he couldn't quite name. A distant creak of the wooden floorboards interrupted the silence. He froze, his ears straining for any further sound. But the house was old, prone to settling into itself. He convinced himself it was nothing. His attention returned to the book, the pages now trembling slightly in his grasp. Both assassins had 3 names. John Wilkes Booth. Lee Harvey Oswald. Each name, 15 letters. He muttered the names under his breath, the syllables carrying a strange rhythm that sent shivers up his spine. The clock's hum grew louder, like a steady pulse drilling into his skull. He glanced at it, expecting to see its hands ticking forward. But they weren't. The clock was still. The realization clawed at his mind, and his breath quickened. A sharp knock echoed from somewhere deep in the house. It wasn't the casual knock of a visitor. It was deliberate, purposeful, and close. His chair screeched as he stood abruptly, the book slipping from his hands and landing with a hollow thud on the wooden floor. He stepped toward the door, the sound of his own heartbeat deafening. The knock came again. Louder this time. He reached for the brass handle, its chill biting into his palm. The door opened with a groan, revealing a shadowy figure shrouded in darkness. Alexei, the figure rasped, the voice a haunting echo of something ancient. You've seen too much. The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy, slicing through the tension like a knife. Alexei's chest tightened as though invisible hands gripped his ribs. The figure remained unmoving, their face obscured by the dim light of the hallway. A cold draft crept into the room, swirling around his feet and carrying with it the faint scent of iron and damp earth. I don't know what you're talking about, Alexei stammered, his voice breaking. His hand still clutched the doorknob, its chill seeping into his bones. The figure leaned forward, just enough for the light to catch the edge of their face. Pale. Gaunt. Eyes hollow, as though the very essence of life had been drained from them. You've connected the threads, the figure murmured, their voice carrying an eerie calm. Threads that should have remained severed. Alexei took a step back, his legs brushing against the chair he had abandoned moments ago. The figure stepped inside without invitation, their movements impossibly smooth, as if they were gliding rather than walking. The door slammed shut behind them, though Alexei hadn't touched it. The sound reverberated through the room, sending books toppling from their precarious stacks. What do you mean? The book, Alexei gestured weakly toward the fallen volume. It's just history, isn't it? The figure let out a low chuckle, a sound that sent icy tendrils crawling up Alexei's spine. History, yes, they replied, their voice dripping with disdain. But history is not a coincidence. It's a pattern. A cycle. Their bony hand extended, pointing toward the book on the floor. You've read what you shouldn't have. Seen what wasn't meant for you. The words ignited a flicker of anger in Alexei's chest, momentarily pushing back the fear. I don't understand, he snapped, his voice louder now. I didn't do anything. I was just reading. The figure tilted their head, as though studying him with some dark amusement. That's where it begins, they said softly. And where it ends. The air in the room grew heavier, pressing down on Alexei like a suffocating weight. The shadows along the walls seemed to stretch and twist, reaching for him with grasping fingers. He stumbled backward, his heel catching on the edge of the fallen book. As he fell, the room spun violently, and for a brief, horrifying moment, he felt as though he was being pulled into the shadows themselves. But just before darkness consumed him, the figure's voice rang out, cold and commanding. Remember, Alexei. The pattern always finds you. And then, silence. Alexei's eyes snapped open, and he gasped for air as if surfacing from the depths of an icy lake. The room around him was dark now, the warm glow of the desk lamp replaced by an unsettling gloom. He lay sprawled on the wooden floor, his limbs trembling as though he'd been running for miles. The book was gone. His hands patted the floor around him frantically, searching for its familiar leather cover. Nothing. The desk, the stacks of books, even the clock, all were exactly where they had been. But the book was nowhere to be found. His heart thudded erratically, the echoes of the figure's voice still reverberating in his mind. The pattern always finds you. He forced himself to stand, his legs weak and unsteady beneath him. The faint metallic taste of fear lingered in his mouth, and his ears rang with a high-pitched whine that refused to fade. The room felt different now, as though the very walls had shifted, leaning in closer to trap him within. Alexei moved toward the door, his hand shaking as he reached for the handle. It was ice-cold, as though it had been left open to the winter air, but it turned easily. The hallway outside was empty, shrouded in shadows that seemed to pulse and breathe with a life of their own. A chill raced down his spine as he took a cautious step forward, the creak of the floorboards beneath him unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. "Hello?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. It echoed strangely, bouncing back at him distorted and unfamiliar. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood, though there was no fire to be seen. Ahead, faintly, a flicker of light danced at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't warm or inviting, it was cold, a pale blue that shimmered like frost under moonlight. Compelled by some force he couldn't understand, Alexei moved toward it, his steps slow and deliberate. The walls seemed to stretch as he walked, the hallway elongating unnaturally, as though he'd never reached the end. But the light grew brighter, almost blinding now. His shadow stretched out before him, distorted and wrong, bending at impossible angles. When he finally reached the end of the hallway, he stopped. There, suspended in the middle of an empty room, was the book. It hovered, its pages fluttering as though caught in an invisible wind. The air vibrated with a low hum, and Alexei felt his chest tighten, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on him. He reached out slowly, his fingers trembling as they inched closer to the book. The moment his hand brushed its cover, the room erupted in a deafening roar. A cacophony of whispers filled his ears, each one overlapping the other, too many voices to comprehend. The light around him dimmed, and the shadows surged forward, wrapping around his body like vines. Alexei tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the book's title, its letters shifting and rearranging themselves into a single chilling word. Inevitable. Alexei awoke to the sound of whispers, faint and fragmented, as if carried on a distant wind. His body felt heavy, pinned against a surface that was neither cold nor warm, neither soft nor hard. He blinked into the darkness, his eyes struggling to adjust. The room, or wherever he was bathed in an otherworldly glow. It wasn't the pale light of a moon or the sterile glare of a bulb. It was alive, pulsating, shifting, like the faint phosphorescence of deep ocean currents. He tried to sit up, but his limbs wouldn't respond. It was as if his body had been disconnected from his will, tethered by unseen forces. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, yet still incomprehensible. They weren't in any language Alexei recognized. Instead, they seemed to crawl into his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. Words, no, thoughts, spilled into his consciousness. The cycle repeats. History demands balance. You've seen too much. The last phrase struck him like a thunderclap, reverberating through his skull. He felt a deep, primal fear, the kind that reaches into the core of one's being and shakes loose every thread of rational thought. A flicker of movement caught his attention. He turned his head, slowly, painfully, toward the source. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, stepping into the pulsing glow. They were familiar yet grotesque. Abraham Lincoln, his face solemn but distorted, the left side of his skull caved in as if frozen in the moment of his death. John F. Kennedy followed, his eyes empty, a dark, jagged wound splitting the back of his head. Behind them were others, shadows of men and women Alexei couldn't immediately recognize. Their faces blurred and flickered, as though caught between moments in time. They formed a circle around him, their hollow gazes fixed on his paralyzed form. Lincoln was the first to speak, his deep voice echoing unnaturally in the airless void. You have breached the veil, Alexei. You have glimpsed the design. Kennedy stepped forward, his movements deliberate and mechanical, like a marionette guided by invisible strings. And now you must pay the price, he intoned, his voice layered with an eerie harmony, as if several versions of him spoke at once. The circle tightened, the figures stepping closer, their distorted features looming above Alexei. He wanted to scream, to beg, to plead, but the weight of their presence crushed every sound before it could escape his throat. The whispers returned, louder and sharper, spiraling into a crescendo that threatened to shatter his mind. Then, in one synchronized movement, the figures extended their hands toward him. Each hand bore a mark, a sigil that glowed with the same living light as the room. The sigils began to pulse, their light growing brighter, hotter, until it consumed everything. Alexei's vision filled with blinding white, and the whispers reached a deafening roar before falling silent. He was no longer there. Or anywhere at all. The silence was suffocating. It wasn't the quiet of an empty room, nor the calm of solitude. It was the void, absolute and infinite. Alexei floated in it, weightless, his body a faint echo of what it once was. There was no sense of up or down, no boundaries, no light. Just nothingness. And yet, he was aware. The whispers had gone, replaced by a single voice. It was deep, resonant, and everywhere at once. You are now part of the pattern, it intoned, the words vibrating through his very essence. Alexei tried to respond, but his voice was gone. He felt a pulling sensation, subtle at first, then stronger, as if some invisible force were dragging him forward. Shapes began to emerge from the void, faint at first, then sharper, like ink spreading across a blank page. It was a city. but not a city as he had ever known. The streets were impossibly long and straight, crisscrossing in perfect geometric patterns that stretched into the horizon. Buildings rose from the ground in sharp, angular towers, their surfaces shimmering with an unnatural iridescence. The sky above was a swirling vortex of black and silver, as if time itself were being torn apart and stitched back together. Alexei found himself standing, or perhaps floating, on one of the streets. The ground beneath his feet was smooth and cold, like polished obsidian. The air was thick, charged with an energy that made his skin prickle. Figures moved around him, faceless shadows draped in cloaks that seemed to merge with the darkness. They paid him no mind, their movements deliberate and mechanical, as though each step had been preordained. Ahead of him, a towering structure loomed, its shape jagged and alien, pulsating with the same eerie glow he had seen before. Compelled by an unseen force, Alexei began to move toward it. His legs carried him forward, though he wasn't sure if he was walking or being pulled. As he neared the structure, he saw the sigil again, the same one that had glowed on the hands of the figures in the void. It was etched into the surface of the building, its lines pulsating like veins under skin. The closer he got, the louder the hum became, a low, bone-rattling vibration that seemed to come from within him as much as from the structure itself. When he reached the base of the tower, the ground beneath him began to shift, rippling like water. A doorway appeared, its edges jagged and uneven, as if torn from the fabric of reality. Without hesitation, without choice, he stepped through. Inside, the air was colder, heavier, and thick with the scent of burning ozone. The walls were alive, shifting and pulsing, covered in the same sigils, each one glowing faintly. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it lay the book. Its leather cover was worn, its edges frayed, but the title had changed again. It no longer read the curious parallels of history or inevitable. Instead, it bore his name, Alexei Vassiliev. His breath caught, a wave of dread washing over him. Before he could process the impossibility of it, the book opened on its own. Pages turned rapidly, their edges glowing as they flipped, stopping abruptly at a blank page. Lines of text began to form, written in the same glowing script. But the words weren't foreign. They were his thoughts. Every moment of doubt, fear, and curiosity he had experienced since opening the book. It was all there, etched into its pages as though it had been waiting for him. And then, beneath the last line, new text began to appear. The cycle must continue. Choose your successor. Alexei's pulse quickened. His successor? The whispers returned, faint but insistent, urging him forward. The pedestal shifted, a second book appearing beside the first. It was identical in every way, except the cover was blank. Alexei reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered above the new book. The whispers grew louder, forming a single, chilling phrase. Write the next name. Alexei's hand hovered over the blank book, the weight of the command crushing him. The whispers swirled around him, growing louder, their tones overlapping in a cacophony of urgency and malice. Write the next name. He pulled his hand back, his fingers curling into a fist. No, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the oppressive hum that filled the room. The walls around him seemed to ripple in response, their glowing sigils flaring brightly as if angered by his defiance. The whispers sharpened, transforming into a single voice that boomed like thunder. You cannot break the cycle. Choose, or the cycle will choose for you. Alexei stumbled back, his chest tightening as panic surged through him. He looked around the room, searching for any sign of escape, but the doorway through which he'd entered was gone. The room was sealed, its shifting walls pressing closer with each passing second. He turned back to the books, his mind racing. If he chose someone, he would condemn them to whatever horrifying fate awaited. If he refused, he sensed that the cycle would not spare him either. The second book began to glow, its cover pulsating like a heartbeat. The whispers softened, their tone almost pleading now. It must continue. The pattern demands balance. Tears welled in Alexei's eyes, his body trembling under the weight of the decision. He thought of everyone he knew, friends, family, even strangers he'd passed on the street. How could he condemn anyone to this nightmare? His gaze fell back to the book with his name etched into its cover. Was this how it had happened to others before him? Had they, too, been forced to choose? The realization struck him like a hammer. The cycle wasn't just about Lincoln and Kennedy or the bizarre coincidences of history. It was a design, an ancient force feeding off the lives it ensnared. And now it had him. The second book began to hum, its glow intensifying, and Alexei felt an invisible force pulling him closer. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "No," he said again, louder this time. "I won't do it." The whispers roared back, furious and unrelenting. The pattern cannot be denied. The room erupted in light, the sigils on the walls blazing brighter than ever. Alexei screamed as the force lifted him off the ground, holding him suspended in the air. His body felt as though it were being torn apart, every nerve alight with pain. Then, with a final surge of energy, the light collapsed inward, and the room fell into darkness. When Alexei opened his eyes, he was standing in a quiet, nondescript library. The air was still, the only sound the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. On the table before him lay two books. One bore his name. The other was blank. He stared at them, his heart pounding in his chest. But this time, there was no voice, no whispers, no force compelling him to act. The choice was his. And he was utterly alone. Alexei stood frozen in the library, staring at the two books lying on the table. The air was heavy with silence, oppressive and still, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. The seconds dragged on, each one hammering the weight of the decision he was left to make. His name etched on one book, the other blank, a canvas waiting to trap the next soul. He glanced around the room, searching for any sign of the figure, the shadows, or the pulsing light that had consumed him moments ago. But there was nothing. The room was plain, ordinary even, with walls lined with shelves full of dusty volumes and a single window that revealed only darkness. For the first time, Alexei questioned if he had imagined it all. The whispers, the figures, the unbearable light, had his mind fractured under the weight of the bizarre coincidences he'd read about? But the books on the table were real. Tangible. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing the worn leather of the book with his name on it. It was warm to the touch, pulsing faintly as though it had a heartbeat. The sensation sent a shiver up his spine, and he recoiled. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. His gaze shifted to the blank book, its pristine cover unmarred, a void waiting to be filled. It looked harmless, but Alexei knew better. It wasn't just a book. It was a trap. A curse. The cycle would continue if he wrote a name inside. And if he didn't? Would the pattern consume him entirely, erasing him from existence as it seemed to promise earlier? His hands trembled, and his breath quickened. The memories of the figure's chilling words echoed in his mind, "The pattern always finds you." Suddenly, a thought struck him, a realization so simple yet so dangerous that it made his pulse race. What if the cycle could only exist because people believed in it? What if it wasn't inevitable but perpetuated by fear and compliance? He stared at the books again, his jaw tightening. There had to be a way to break it. Without giving himself time to second-guess, Alexei grabbed both books. The instant his hands closed around them, the room began to tremble, the air vibrating with an otherworldly hum. The window shattered outward, shards of glass vanishing into the darkness beyond. The books grew hotter in his hands, searing his skin, but he refused to let go. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Alexei turned and hurled both books into the void outside the window. The hum grew deafening, rising to an unbearable crescendo. The walls of the library began to collapse inward, folding and twisting in on themselves as if reality itself were unraveling. Alexei braced himself, expecting the worst, but then... silence. He opened his eyes. The library was gone. He was standing in his apartment, the faint morning light filtering through the curtains. The clock on the wall ticked softly, its hands moving forward as they always had. The desk lamp cast a warm, steady glow. The book, The Curious Parallels of History, was nowhere to be found. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Alexei felt the crushing weight lift from his chest. He wasn't sure if the cycle was truly broken or if it had simply moved on. But as he stood there, the morning light warming his face, he made a silent vow. He would leave the past in the past, bury his curiosity, and never seek answers to questions better left unanswered. And for the first time in days, he felt something he thought he'd lost forever. Hope.